We have a rare pleasure in store for us this afternoon. Dr. Walle Nauta, Institute Professor at MIT and Professor of Neuroscience, is here to share thoughts with us about his career and about neuroscience in general. Dr. Nauta, would you like to begin by telling us something of your early career?
Yes, I was born in Indonesia, where I spent the first 10 years of my life. Then came to Holland, where I first had to finish high school, of course, and then my years at the University of Leiden. I was a student of medicine. You may know that in the European system, the years here specifically called college are sort of integrated into high school on the proximal side and the professional school on the distal side. So I was a student of medicine, and really at a very early age, at a very early stage, I became interested in particular in the basic medical sciences, physiology, anatomy, biochemistry. They all fascinated me because it was obvious from the way we were being taught these disciplines that really only relatively little was known about them. I suppose that can be said at any time about any discipline, but it was then emphasized continually by the clinicians that really a much broader base of fundamental biological information was needed for further progress of the medical sciences. And so, at a rather early age, I was left with the impression that this is a very worthwhile field to go into. I was perhaps in particular impressed with the nervous system by two circumstances. And in the first place, we had an excellent teacher of anatomy who told us about the brain, but perhaps the person who most profoundly influenced me and sort of biased me in the direction of the neurosciences. That term didn't exist at that time, but we would now call it neurosciences, was Rademacher, who was of the school of Magnus, as the Klein had been of the school of Magnus. They were an extremely distinguished group of neurophysiologists, basically, of course, Sherringtonian neurophysiologists, and all of them in particular interested in motor mechanisms and equilibrium. In any case, Rademacher was a brilliant lecturer. It's remarkable. I'm always reminded of him when I see Robert McNeil in his TV shows. He not only looked very similar, but he also had the same general self-projection as McNeil has. He had a sort of a laconic confidence, really, that was at any time ready to give up an opinion and to consider another opinion. He tremendously influenced every medical student who passed through his lecture rooms. And we were sitting in the windowsills, really, listening to Rademacher's lectures on the physiology of the nervous system. I believe that my greatest push in the direction of an interest in brain came through Rademacher. Rademacher had a number of remarkable things that he used to say. He really didn't like to see us all taking notes and really being entirely absorbed in the content of what he was saying. And occasionally he got a little mad at us for doing that. And he then darkened the room, and on the screen came a slide saying, the worst textbook is probably a lot better than my lectures. Now, I have always admired Rademacher for saying that, and he meant it. Now, those were the preclinical years. During my clinical years, I naturally was very interested in neurology, and anything related to the brain, including also, of course, psychiatry and neurosurgery. But the difficulty was that at that time, the neurology department was in a state of reorganization and had profound difficulties getting off the ground. And I never felt that really these early years contributed much to my to any decision I might have made otherwise to become a clinical neurologist or a psychiatrist, for that matter, or a neurosurgeon. In any case, rather late during my rotating internship, I fell in love with ophthalmology, and specifically, of course, in neuro-ophthalmology. It was then that I decided that perhaps that was a splendid discipline to really adopt as a major interest, and I was planning to register as an applicant for assistantship in the Department of Ophthalmology that would then later become a full internship. But I was frustrated in that because in 1939 the war broke out. And the war, when I say war, I don't mean the Vietnam War. It was the Second World War. It changed so many plans, it cancelled so many good intentions that absolutely no one could be sure anymore what 5 years hence the situation of the world would be, much less one's own personal situation would be like. In any case, I was in many ways rather lucky, because it was at that time that I got an appointment. You see, teaching was never interfered with, the teaching of medicine, whether preclinical or clinical. The occupying forces, in 1940 we became occupied, of course. The occupying forces actually thought it was very important that all of Europe would have good medical care, and they never interfered with the training of doctors, except that certain universities had aroused their ire because of political opinions rather in conflict with the Nazi philosophy, And the University of Leiden was closed. It was called a hornet's nest by the Dutch Nazis, and the university was closed. So those of us who had not finished their studies yet, and I was among them, really had to go to another university to get those last few years, or last few months. In my case, it was not more than 2 months in to complete the study, the official study of medicine. I'm saying the official study of medicine because it's one thing that I have learned about medicine, and that is you never stop being a student. I think to take on the study of medicine makes you a lifetime apprentice of medicine. In any case, at the University of Utrecht, there was an instructor needed in anatomy, and since I had functioned somewhat in that capacity in Leiden in previous years as a technical assistant in the practical courses in anatomy, the dissecting course among others, I had no difficulty becoming appointed to that job. So from there on, my life moved from from Leiden to the city of Utrecht, which is no more than about 40 miles east of Leiden, but 40 miles during the war really was an almost insurmountable obstacle because of transportation difficulties. In any case, this is where I made a start at the University of Utrecht. I made a start teaching anatomy, and I should point out that no one at that time was allowed to teach in a particular subject that he made his specialty. And I was immediately told that even if I thought of myself as a future neuroanatomist, the department needed an instructor for all the components of anatomy, and that was it. And with a bit of luck, one of these years I might have my turn in neuroanatomy. Well, this was the time when I was looking at collections that were left there by various predecessors, some of them brain slides, and came to the conclusion that what clearly was needed was a lot more knowledge about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus at that time had become a rather notable subject of inquiry. We had the example of the Ransons in Chicago and Walter Rudolf Hess in Zurich, and neither of these groups seemed to make a particular effort in finding out more detail about the connectivity of the hypothalamus. It seemed to me at that time that that was a very serious deficit and that something ought to be done about it. It was at that time that they began to try and see if perhaps the Marquis technique might work, and predictably the Marquis technique didn't help one bit. There simply isn't enough heavily myelinated connectivity in the hypothalamus, and the Marquis stained only the coarsest of the fibers, and exactly where you would like to know more, it quit on you. Now then came a method by Rozdolski, it's a curious technique in which, with a very simple combination of methyl blue and eosin, pictures were obtained and shown in photograph. Pictures were obtained of normal fibers in blue and degenerating fibers in red. There was a group in England, Beatty, Brow and Long, who published an article that they had done of a study that they had done with the Rosdolsky technique. And of course I was extremely interested in trying that, and tried and tried and tried and tried for a whole year and never got anything at all. And later I heard that really the technique had helped people only in a very limited number of laboratories. It was clear that it, in our hands, really was practically useless. Either we were doing it wrong, or there was some chemical obstacle that made us unsuccessful. Now, at that point, I came to the conclusion that, yes, one really needs something entirely different. And silver techniques seem to be a logical basis to start from. The two great techniques, both dating back to the turn of the century. The silver, the block impregnation with silver by Cajal, and the section impregnation of Birzhowski. And either of the two. I started out with the Cajal technique, and especially because shortly before the war, in 1937, David Bolian at Western Reserve University and the anatomy department published a method in which the silver agent was a silver proteinate called protargol. And the technique could be used on paraffin sections. And this, of course, really at that time, I should make that remark, at that time, paraffin was just about the only practicable way of getting serial sections of brains of any material. The Saloiden method, of course, took an enormous amount of time, the embedding being so protracted. And the frozen section technique was something that really very few who tried it on whole blocks of brain really stayed with for very long. It is mostly at that time the clinical microtome, the rapid sectorial movement of the knife really is incompatible with the cutting of serial sections of the brain. So that was the reason why I started out with Cajal-type impregnations, and indeed found that the Bolian technique, if you modify it just very slightly, gives beautiful pictures in the degenerating optic system. Following enucleation of an eye, you can find fiber degeneration, really, and can chart it out, and it's really quite respectable. However, I also found that in fiber systems with a finer fiber caliber, such as, for example, I took the fornix as an example, really as something that is composed of very largely thin fibers, and found that the technique was totally useless there. Now, this was really rather unsettling, and it was obvious that what was needed was an entirely new method that could improve upon the Cajal-type techniques. By that time, I had come to the conclusion that Bodian and the Cajal stains were probably both belonging to the both belonging to the category of Cajal-type silver stains, that they probably were not the correct base to start from, and I shifted to the Bilshevsky technique. At just about this time, the condition in universities rapidly worsened as the occupying forces were beginning to make a concerted effort to round up all young men of student age who were not visibly employed, and they put them to work. If they caught them, they put them to work on the other side of the border in Germany. Well, this was the time that students disappeared, really. And I, since I at that time also was a young man, it almost seems like 100 years ago, I too had to find a very visible way of being usefully employed. And this was the time that I spent a year, or it was actually a little more than a year, in general practice as a locum tenens. And there were many doctors, of course, at that time who were really very handicapped when they, through illness or accident, had to either slow down or be inactive for a particular period of time, and who found really the very diminished crop of young physicians able to come to their assistance. And so I had no difficulty really finding a locum tenens. This was a year that I remember was a mixture of awe and delight. The delight is that I will never again, after that experience, be so ready to put blame on the general practitioner for not being more than just that, general practitioner. And that is the awe and the delight. What I also found was that in all likelihood it would not be the clinic of medicine, of any field of medicine, would probably not be compatible with my general nature. I always had a feeling one ought to dig in this hole, and so being of apparently a rather compulsive type, I made a conclusion that I would probably be better off in the basic medical sciences, where I had been up to that time anyway. After that year, I returned to the university. The Germans were now in retreat, really all over the map of Europe. They were no longer particularly active rounding up young people from adjacent countries. And when I returned to the university, of course, the students were still unable to show their faces. So there was a minimum of teaching, and this was the time that I could normally have started really doing some concentrated work, but no, no such luck. What happened was that a very great number of chemical substances, and unfortunately including silver nitrate, were no longer available. They had all been requisitioned by the occupying forces. For silver nitrate, I never realized it until then, is a very necessary ingredient in the explosives industry, and so it disappeared entirely. And the same was true of other things, of many dyestuffs disappeared, could no longer be had. Alcohol disappeared. It was, in a word, almost impossible to work in an anatomy laboratory anymore. And since that was so, and I was still very much obsessed by the idea that we had to find a good technique for degenerating fine fibers, and the fornix was such a good example of such a system, that I thought I had noticed in making my first lesions a year earlier, before I went into the general practice for that year, I had noticed that rats in which you cut the fornix, at least if you do it the way I did it, which was simply with a bent hook introduced into the midline of the brain and then turning it around, which sometimes cut one, sometimes cut both fornices, and very often with extensive damage to the septum just in front of the fornix column. What I found, what I had noticed, was that these rats show peculiar changes in character. They become extraordinarily reactive. They're dangerous animals to handle. They can, for example, when you open a cage, they can suddenly come lunging out at you. And this disappears again after a few months, but in that 3-month period, it's a most impressive phenomenon. So I thought, well, perhaps I should make some small lesions and just try to do things that I hadn't primarily intended to do, but was now forced to do because of that lack of materials. Simply look at animal behavior following small lesions in the brain. And this led finally in 1945 to my doctoral dissertation. The doctoral dissertation was on the subject of hypothalamic mechanisms observing sleep and wakefulness. And this was really an one and only sortie I made into neurophysiology of the Sherringtonian type. And after that, the war was over, and things I could go back to more specifically anatomical studies. I should say perhaps one thing about the circumstances under which we in university laboratories worked. Even if you had an MD degree, you might become interested in also becoming a more scientist type of person, more of a laboratory scientist. And there was at that time really no organization of academic life in medical school that made that possible. If we were appointed to a medical school department, such as anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, we were paid only for doing our teaching. One and only raison d'etre was one's collaboration in the overall teaching effort. There was no specific arrangement for students who wanted to become scientists. It is all the more amazing because at the same time that there was this de-emphasis on an organized, academically recognized program of scientific endeavor, those who advanced in faculty rank, from instructor, for example, to assistant professor and so on, these promotions were indeed very much dependent on having done research. But research was done more or less as an afterthought. One did that on the sly, so to speak. And the same was true in my case, of course. I had an unusual situation. I wrote my doctoral dissertation and did all the experiments for it during a year that the University of Utrecht and university life in Holland in general was at a complete standstill. And so I had quite a lot of time that I normally would not have had. Well, let me say then, the war was finally over in 1945. I went to the back to the University of Leiden as an assistant professor in anatomy, and after a year moved to another country, Switzerland, the University of Zurich, where there was an open space for a Dutch university person. And this was a sort of a return gesture that the University of Zurich had made to the University of Leiden, when Leiden, 50 years earlier, had helped the University of Zurich restock its library after a very ugly fire that destroyed much of Zurich's university library. So I had the tremendous good fortune to be that person appointed in medical school department. It was the anatomy department of the University of Zurich. And it is there that I really began full force trying to see what could be done to get degenerating fibers to stain. The situation there at the University of Zurich was very nearly ideal, with the exception of one point, and that is that the University of Zurich had an enormously intense teaching program. I remember having had in some semesters as many as 27 hours a week of actual student contact, either in practical courses or in lectures, up to 8 hours of lectures a week and the rest in practical courses. Now, this really interfered, of course, with a lot of the research that one would like to do in that time. And when I tell my students nowadays about burdens that heavy, 3 semesters of that semester load, really, that teaching load, all of them shudder and say, I couldn't do any research at that time, and what a horrible waste of time anyway. And perhaps I'm a little missionary in this, but I have the distinct feeling that I owe a lot to my teaching burdens, to the teaching burdens I had to comply with. The trouble, namely, if you do not teach, is that your window remains relatively small. You tend to concentrate on a particular thing. In teaching, you are absolutely forced, especially if that teaching includes gross anatomy, histology, embryology, and then, yes, also neuroanatomy. Your window becomes larger and larger on a larger and larger subject. And I must frankly say that I believe that I owe much to my need to teach there so much. There is moreover one type of payoff that I hear very few people mention. That is that if you think it's all a waste of time, then consider that when you keep doing it and you become more and more adept at responding to students' questions and so on, you may from time to time have the exciting experience of hearing yourself formulate something that you did not know you could formulate. Some of the better ideas that occurred to me in neuroanatomy occurred to me, or the germ of the idea occurred to me in the heat of the battle, where I tried to explain something that, and suddenly heard myself say something that I didn't know I could say. Now, this in defense of teaching. For the rest, yes, many hours, many hours, of course, are taken away from potential laboratory time. There's no doubt about that. Well, I don't know if I should bother you giving all the sordid details of how I finally arrived at that so-called Nauta technique that is now no longer used, but at that time was sorely needed, really. It came about really over a period of about 6 years. And I had several people helping me, in particular a young dyestuff chemist from the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule, the ETH in Zurich, Paul Andreas Gigax, who assisted me really with unusual energy and with a very great knowledge of the interface between organic and inorganic chemistry. Without Gigax, I would not have gotten off the ground, I believe. The presence of Gigax made it possible, in any case, to be a little more than entirely empirical in the whole process of working out a staining technique, starting from a baseline that was characterized by staining of all fibers, degenerating usually excluded. The Bilshowski stain that we then used that required frozen sectioning is a general survey stain. It stains normal fibers but no degenerating fibers unless you do something to the sections before. And that something that had to be done to the sections before took us years to find out. It was a sequence of 2 mordants, one of which was phosphomolyptic acid, and the other one potassium permanganate, but only in that order. In the opposite order, you got nothing at all. Well, pretty pictures, but no degenerating fibers. In any case, I owe much to a man I met at another person I met at the ETH, at the Technological Institute there, an American Air Force major, Major Lloyd Ryan, who assisted me also, mostly by his enormous knowledge of the chemistry of photography. It wasn't his field, his professional field, but it had been a lifelong interest he had. And he was of very great moral and material support to me. I owe much to him too.
The water was critical. There were many...
Yes, there was a technique that had been worked out in Oxford by Paul Glees, and that was referred to as the Glees technique. And in Oxford, some remarkably interesting studies had been done with it. And then, pretty soon thereafter, Brodal in Oslo began to work with it, and he too had success using the technique. And when we tried it in Zurich, we got nowhere. And I'm sure that we didn't do anything that wasn't in the reported protocol. And I tend to think, and that is forever a difficulty in sort of communicating from one laboratory to another laboratory, that you very often, as a scientist, do not realize a little trick that you think is totally immaterial, and that for that reason you don't even want to write into your description. And it may, in the end, turn out to be crucial. In any case, whatever the reason, the Glees method did not work for us, and we simply had to have something else.
Well, now, Dr. Nauta, what about the period after you came to Walter Reed and got going with your work in this country, and subsequently you moved to MIT? You must have come across many memorable personalities in the neurosciences in those years.
Well, let me say, Ed, that I was mostly brought in touch with remarkable personalities through the much more active life in America, in associations and other types of gatherings of scientists, of which Europe had almost zero. There was very little done to organize and to bring people together who shared interests. And this is the first thing that struck me when I came to America, how many the opportunities were to meet your colleagues and to meet those who, like yourself, had an interest in certain things. I remember the first meeting of the American Association of Anatomists. It was held at Brown University in Providence. I was thunderstruck, really, meeting there the great names, the people with the great names that, well, I had the feeling I ought to stand there shuddering, really, in their presence. Let me mention a few names. Wendell Creek, Gerhard von Bonin, Marion Hines. There were many whom I had never heard about, who later became people I came to be awestruck by. It was, for me, the first time, really, that I saw so much interest manifested. I also noticed that neuroanatomy had been on the decline, really, very markedly. And that same thing had struck me, and that was one of the reasons why I had started out on methods for fiber regeneration at all in Holland years before. It was a remarkable thing that neuroanatomy was almost at a standstill. In the 1940s, one can say, the 1930s, the 1940s, the interest in neuroanatomy was at an all-time low. I could, when I wrote an article, as we did, on the connections of the optic nerve in the rat, I could, so to speak, write a reference list in literature. It was no more than perhaps 20 names. If you were to try the same thing now, it would be really almost a book in itself. No, just the bibliography of what you were talking about. At that time, it was possible for a neuroanatomist to know the names, to be familiar with the names of practically every colleague of his that wrote in articles in the better known journals. Of course, there were some in very obscure journals, they might escape you, but the better known journals, for example, had perhaps something in the order of 40 neuroanatomists publishing. And this is something I am, quite frankly, you want my, I hope, my frank feelings about these things. This, I thought, was really the thing that I later became proudest of, that technique of ours, no matter how primitive and no matter how obsolete it now is, at that time was absolutely needed and started a new current of interest.
Absolutely.
And I say that in all due humility, or I should perhaps say I say that in all due arrogance. It was the very thought that made me decide 6 to 10 years earlier to try and work something out.
Where do you see all of this going in the future?
Yeah, what we see now, there are of course vastly better techniques in neuroanatomy, such as the labeling techniques, both anterograde and retrograde, partly label that is demonstrated by immunohistochemical techniques. It is all an extremely admirable field. The technology of experimental systems neuroanatomy is at an enviable high at the moment. It's almost impossible to imagine that very much more would need to be added. But of course, at any time, that kind of judgment is based on the needs one can reasonably foresee at this moment in time. And 5 years, 10 years, 20 years hence, these things may be very, very much different. Meanwhile, of course, there has been a revolution in biology in general that has also affected the brain sciences. The revolution is called molecular biology. And really, I must say, I welcome the expansion of the neurosciences in that direction. I am not saying that we can now forget about the rest and all become molecular neurobiologists. I still think that basically all dimensions in the neurosciences are of equal importance. I sometimes nostalgically think of the wonderful things that might yet have been discovered if the technique of Sherrington, basically a truncation of the brain, a progressive truncation, had not been abandoned at the time. Far more sophisticated methods became available, such as recording from neurons, and later even recording from either the inside of neurons or the outside of neurons. All these things. I see a lot of great benefit coming from this. The fact that there now is a chemical neuroanatomy to duplicate what we in our time really should have called the systems neuroanatomy. There is now a chemical systems neuroanatomy to duplicate it. I think that these things are marvelous, but they can promise only improvement of our understanding of the brain only under one condition, that we do not at the same time forget what went before. I really think that chemical neuroanatomy makes sense only when you know something about neuroanatomy. And I'm sure that the same is true for neurophysiology, that the molecular biology of receptors, for example, is of interest only in the context of a much larger entity that we should call brain science, or, if you wish, neurophysiology.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nauta,
It
for
was my pleasure.
these reflections.
Thank
They're
you.
most stimulating.